This is my Philodendron Ring of Fire. It's just over 2 years old, and in today's video we're looking at the journey that the plant and I have been through together. I'll tell you anything that I learned about this plant. Oh, hello. And we also need to repot this plant and upgrade its existing moss pole. Are you going to help me? Or are you just going to look pretty, huh? Oh, look at you, so handsome. Right, let's go. Can I maybe park this next to you over here? Is that okay? Alright. Hello everybody and welcome back to our YouTube channel. We're back with a plant spotlight and today's focus is on Philodendron Ring of Fire. There's a few things to discuss in today's video, but let's get started with the history of this plant first. Yeah? So I got this plant in March 2022, so that's 27 months ago. Actually, when you say it in months, it sounds like it's really old. Just over 2 years old, let's put it that way. And it was quite small at the beginning. When I got it, I'll pop in a photo for you over there. By June 2022, so just 3 months later, you can see that this plant is certainly happy with the conditions that I gave it, and it grew a couple of new leaves. And I really love the new leaves on this philodendron. It doesn't have a new leaf at the moment. They're all a bit older because we're currently during the coldest season, so I haven't seen all too much growth. But when the new growth comes out, it's really fiery red, especially the variegated part that then later on fades to yellow. I suppose that's probably why it got its name Ring of Fire. Now what you can also see in that photo is that it really grows as a ring. It grows really wild in all directions, right? And even back then when it was quite juvenile, it already started taking up quite a lot of space. At this stage it's still in a 10 centimeter pot, so teeny tiny pot, but it would actually take up quite a large footprint based on its large spread. Couple of months later, so what are we then, 22 months ago, I put this plant on a moss pole, and it has been on this moss pole ever since. For the sake of today, let's just call it 2 years, right? So this plant has been on this particular moss pole for the last 2 years. Now when I first popped it on the moss pole, you can see in that photo over there that the one leaf that would have actually gone like through the pole was kind of just facing up against the pole. Eventually that would have just twisted around, and I think it might even be this leaf down here. Maybe it's not that leaf down there. Maybe it is, hang on. Maybe that leaf doesn't exist anymore. Could easily be that this leaf doesn't exist anymore. Well, basically back then it was not in need for a moss pole whatsoever, but I gave it a moss pole for two particular reasons. First of all, I like to keep my pots quite small, so I kept that in a 14 centimeter pot, but the moss pole is a vertical extension of the pot, so I'm actually doubling the potted volume, or the volume that the root mass can take over, by giving it that vertical extension. Secondly, that vertical extension is stopping that leaf from going backwards, so I'm basically creating a half moon display for this plant rather than it being a full circle or full ring of fire. I have a half ring of fire, and it is purely for aesthetic purposes. I want all the leaves to face one side, so I have one nice display side, because this pole is going to be backed up against a wall or backed up against my greenhouse wall or something like that. So there's no point in me having leaves 360 degrees around the plant. Realistically, I would have absolutely nowhere to put this plant because it would take up so much space. I mean, you can see how big that spread is over here. Imagine that, 306, I couldn't even sit here. I would need to sit like here somewhere. Are they starting to chainsaw out there right now? We will just have to keep going because I don't think they'll ever stop out there. I then kind of couldn't find any photos for this plant, but luckily I film houseplant tours quite frequently. So let's have a quick look at a houseplant tour from 1 year ago. So this is my Ring of Fire, and it's grown really well. So this is the newest leaf, and I'm loving that variegation on it. When it first comes out, it's really dark red in color, and then it fades to this more yellow, and that's, I suppose, why it's called Ring of Fire. I have given my Ring of Fire a moss pole. It's not a really fast climber, but you can can see that it has climbed a little bit, and there are some smallish roots going into the moss pole as well. So it is definitely taking advantage of the moss pole. And now let's have a look at a houseplant tour from half a year ago. This little island of plants isn't getting any natural light from the west facing window because the poles behind me just absorb it all. So I've got a Soltec light over here again. This one is the Aspect 40 watts. Is my Ring of Fire. Absolutely love this plant. Probably hard to see with all of the light sources coming from everywhere, but it is literally on fire. Look how nice it looks. And it's dripping down my hand. And here we are now. I have to say, since moving into this new house, the plant hasn't shown all too much growth, and that is, I think, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I gave it worse conditions, definitely way less light exposure. Second of all, it had a lot of flower, and the plant spending energy on inflows often comes at the expense of the plant in itself. You can really see there was an inflow here, 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 out of all of these petioles, and eventually what the plant did, instead of growing continuously from that one growth point that it was used to, it has then also reshot into many growth points. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and a fifth one back here. So this plant is really heavy. So kind of as a result of it growing so many inflows, it kind of, and I don't know, I think it was the inflows. It could have also been shock or whatever. It started kind of just multi-shooting by itself, which is perfect, right? Now, only one shoot is actually growing leaves at the moment. This is the newest leaf over here from this top shoot over here. The others are now only starting to push out their first leaves. So that's great. And I didn't have to do anything. I didn't cut anything. It's just propagating itself. This plant has had a repot in between, but I have never taken it off that original moss pole. So this moss pole is now more than 2 years old, and I can feel there's a lot of root system in here. I can also see that there's a root sticking out the top. So what I want to do today is I want to repot this just to give it some fresh medium, but I also want to open the moss pole and I want to replace it with a larger moss pole that has more volume. I don't need more height. It's a very, very slow climber, but I want to keep that display, and I want to give the plant more room for roots. There's also some roots kind of going off the pole over here at the moment that I would love to funnel back in. Literally, I had all day to film this video, and I was like, let me eat lunch first so I'm not so grumpy in front of the camera. And it was silent all day until I start filming. Anyway, I'm gonna have to take this out of the pot because I want to fundamentally kind of upgrade the moss pole. I'm going to try and remove some of the substrate. The substrate smells fine, doesn't smell like it has rot. It looks okay as well. There's definitely some roots coming off here though. So it's probably a substrate I will reuse outside. I have a lot of repotting to do in spring, some big plants, some big heliconias and so on. So I'll just save that for a repot outside. And I'll give this some fresh substrate instead. Now let's open up the pole. Now I've done this process before, for example with my El Choco, but there I was kind of planning on doing it. I gave it a small moss pole initially so it fits in my greenhouse, a cabinet I mean, and then I upgraded it to a larger pole. So these are poles from Grow Vertical, and they make them in 3 sizes. This is the Pro, and I'm gonna switch it to, they call it Fatty Long. It's kind of double the volume basically. All right, let's have a look. You're gonna get to see it first. Is it good? Oh wow, okay. Look at all of this. Look at all of these roots within the moss pole. So really there was more than 50% of the root system was probably within the pole rather than the actual pot. But you can see there isn't actually much moss here anymore. Although there is some moss, but I feel like the roots are taking over. So as a result of that, the water retention capacity is kind of reduced and so on. So I think it's time to give this a fresh medium. Now, let me think this through. I'm gonna keep this whole thing as one. I'm not gonna take it all apart. I want the plant to not really experience all too much shock. Now this is the Fatty Long from Grow Vertical, so it has 4 extra squares on the grid, so it's a bit thicker. and the plastic is a little bit bigger as well, so it'll hold more volume. I can either just use the new backing with the old mesh, which basically means that it has a shorter front and a thicker, but more volume in the back, or I could also use the new mesh, basically extend the mesh at the front, make it wider, but as a result of that is a more shallow pole. Okay, I think I'll extend the mesh as well, because why the fuck not? So, here. Oh my god, I think the neighbors finally stopped. Yay. Okay, so, now I can finally talk to you. See how this plant is currently growing off the pole a little bit? It is way too thick and thoroughly rooted in here to really manipulate it. So what I'm doing is I'm just cutting out the size of the existing mesh from the new mesh, and then I can cable tie this together and it will basically fit perfect. Ow, ouch. I also don't need it to be that tall, so I'll probably cut it here because this is already pissing me off. I don't need it that tall, but of course I also want more volume for roots, so I'm extending it a little bit, not because the plant is running out of space, just to create more volume for roots. I will also give it a larger pot actually. So today we're doing everything. I have chosen the world's biggest table for this because I love a good challenge. And now I'm just cable tying the new mesh to the old mesh. They're back. At least with the construction side, it's like, yeah, you are constructing a whole fucking house. Of course you can be loud. But these people, just your hedge doesn't even look good after. Didn't look good before either. Oh my god, now it comes the leaf blower. Alright, let me bring you closer. So you can see, new mesh, old mesh over here. This is the new mesh, so this is the mesh extension, and this is what it looks like from the front. You can't really see much, there's too much plant, huh? Not a bad thing, not a bad thing. Now onto the new backing, so let me just cut that to size as well. Alrighty, now I'm just going to cable tie the backing to the mesh. Oh my god, finally. Okay, now let me show you this monstrosity. So we've got the backing here. You can see how much more volume I have created within the pole. Now, first things first, let me pot this up so I don't need to hold it so awkwardly the whole time. And I'm giving this a larger pot, not because it needs it, but because I have an idea for this plant. I have a specific pot in mind for this plant, and that pot works best with a 25 centimeter pot instead of a 20 centimeter pot. Hang on, what am I doing? Oh, I fucked it up. Ah! Okay, so what I should have done is the mesh should have come down to here, so it can stand on the mesh without submerging the whole plant. If I now put this to the bottom of the pot, most of the plant is within the pot, which I don't want. It's going to cause stem rot. So I'm not redoing this. Absolutely not. This took forever as it was. But I'm just going to go against my own principles. And I will not pot this plant all the way to the bottom. Instead, I'll fill it with some aeroid mix first. This pole isn't going to be super tall, so I'm less worried about stability. And let's just hope for the best, and then I'll top it up with more aeroid mix. Alrighty, about 50% of the aeroid mix even made it into the pot. Fantastic, love that for us. Now I'm going to fill the pole with some more moss. Alrighty, and we are done. Now I try to be careful-ish when I put that moss in there, because there is obviously an existing root system within the existing pole, but see how we go. Overall, yes, I repotted this plant, but I didn't really chop the plant, I didn't take away any of the root system, so compared to a normal chop and extend, this should be fairly unintrusive, but we will find out. See if the plant likes it. Now, the reason I gave it this pot is because I have this planter over here that is nice and tall, and this is a perfect fit, which also means when I now water this plant, water can just drip from the pole into the pot and then into the planter, and the plant will never sit in the water. So I can be very liberal with my watering. The volume of water doesn't really matter, because any excess is just gonna drain. But that's not the only reason I've chosen this pot. The other reason is because it elevates it off the floor a little bit. This plant is not gonna grow anytime soon, so it's basically like a pot with a plant stand integrated. And that is because I want to get this a little bit closer to the light. This plant currently lives in this corner over here, and it's supported by a Soltec grow light. And this Soltec grow light has supported this plant for over 1 year now. However, I moved in between. In my old setup, and I'll pop in a photo, I should find one. Yeah, there's definitely one. In my old setup, this plant was, the Soltec grow light was pretty much like here-ish, let's say, right? So it was maybe like a meter maximum away from the plant. And that is really when the plant grew the most, when it gave me these big leaves, the beautiful red variegation and so on. Since moving in here and having the grow light mounted differently, this plant is more like 2 meters away from the grow light, so it's not getting the light intensity anymore, and as a result of that, plus I think the inflows, both of that kind of combined resulted in that plant just not growing as much anymore and not as fast either. So if nothing changes, nothing changes. So I want to change something to hopefully get this plant into, growing mood again. But ultimately, proof will be in the pudding. But that's a good segue into talking about what I learned about this plant. I think this plant can tolerate quite a lot of light, for sure. From my experience, the brighter the light was, the better it grew. Now, of course, keep in mind what your plant is used to as well. If your plant isn't used to a lot of light, then the initial light could kind of burn it. But if the plant has grown up in stronger light, then it should handle it quite well. I would still stay away from like direct summer sun, but like morning sun, afternoon sun, winter sun is perfectly fine, and or a strong grow light. From a humidity perspective, this plant is grown in about 50% humidity, so not super fussy. I would basically like a monstera, not as fussy as like a velvet philodendron, so a little hardier than that. And temperatures I'm growing this plant in winter, it's around about 18 to 20 degrees. In summer, it can go up to 28 degrees where this plant is located. If you really want to get the best out of this plant, don't go under maybe 15 or something like that. It should tolerate it, but it won't be thriving. And I suppose we are aiming at making our plants thrive. You do not need to give this plant a moss pile. You can easily grow this as a clumpy plant. I should really learn the official term for that. Anyway, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I gave it a moss pile because it is technically a climber, and also because I like to use the vertical extension of that pot and create a nice display. So overall, I think this is a really stunning and rewarding plant. They have come out of tissue culture over here in Australia and are fairly readily available at a really affordable price. So definitely a show-stopping plant if you can give it enough light, but it is a space commitment, so keep that in mind. Alrighty, I gotta water this plant, but to do that I need to get through you into the garden, so I will wrap it up over here. Bit of everything in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you watched the full video, please hit like, leave a fire emoji in the comment section, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time. Bye!